I wasn't born with much, but I never thought I'd leave life with even less. My name is Claire Holloway. I'm 59, divorced, and childless, though not by choice. I've spent the last 30 years of my life in a modest home in upstate New York, working as a bookkeeper for small businesses. Nothing glamorous, but honest work. The kind that gives you a sense of control, of order. You need that when the rest of your life is chaos. My parents, Charles and Lorraine, never looked at me the way they looked at my younger sister, Juliet. She was the golden one. From the moment she was born, 3 years after me, she had this glow that seemed to follow her into every room. Blonde hair, perfect skin, that natural charm that made adults melt and children follow. And me? I was the quiet one, the sensitive child. I suppose that was their way of saying I was a disappointment. It wasn't just childhood jealousy. It was a pattern, like wallpaper in our house you grow up staring at. When Juliet wanted piano lessons, they bought her a Steinway. When I said I wanted to write, they told me, dreams don't pay rent. I got hand-me-downs. She got private tutors. When I was old enough to move out, I paid for college myself, working nights and skipping meals. Juliet? She had an entire education funded, along with a brand new car, a BMW. For safety, they said. I stopped asking why a long time ago. Some people are born into luck. Others spend their lives cleaning up after it. Still, I never hated her. At least not then. There were moments, small, flickering moments, when we were sisters in the real sense. Laughing under blankets during thunderstorms. Passing notes about boys in high school. I clung to those moments like pearls on a string. Fragile, rare, precious. But eventually, even those faded. She moved to Manhattan, became a real estate agent for luxury properties, married a man named Glenn Harrow, a stockbroker with just enough of a sleaze factor to make him rich. They had 2 kids, a nanny, and a second home in the Hamptons. I sent Christmas cards. They sent generic photo collages with no handwritten message. My parents visited them every other weekend. Over the years, I watched Juliet become the center of their world. I visited less and less. The conversations became shorter. My calls went unanswered more often than not. Still, I showed up. Birthdays, holidays, funerals. I was always there, even when no one noticed. Especially then. Then came the call last November. My father had passed away in his sleep. Heart failure. He was 81. I drove down that same day. Not because I was asked. No one called me directly. But because it felt like I had to. Like a daughter should. Lorraine greeted me with a stiff hug. Juliet arrived 3 hours later with her family and a bottle of imported wine. We buried him 2 days later. It was cold, and there were only a few tears. Mostly from me. I stayed at the house a few more days to help clean. Mom didn't ask, but I did it anyway. I sorted drawers, packed up old clothes, mended the garden gate. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd see how much I still cared. That she'd thank me, or sit with me over tea like she used to when I was very young. But she didn't. Then came the will. The attorney, a tired man in his 60s named Leonard Cray, met us in the living room. Lorraine sat on the couch in silence, a thin blanket draped across her knees, even though it wasn't cold. Juliet lounged beside her, perfectly made up, checking her phone between glances at the grandfather clock. I sat on the edge of a stiff armchair, my hands clenched in my lap, heart thudding like I was awaiting a verdict. Leonard cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. Charles Holloway left a will, notarized and updated last year. I'll be reading it in full. He read aloud for 10 minutes. There were standard items, a few bequests to charities, instructions for burial. Then came the division of assets. The house, the cars, the savings, the stocks. Everything. To my daughter Juliet Harrow, Leonard read, not even blinking. I leave the totality of my estate, with the full confidence that she will continue to honor the family's legacy. Silence. I didn't look at anyone, not even my mother. And to my daughter Claire, Leonard continued, I leave my love and the hope that she finds peace. That was it. Not even a piece of furniture, not a ring, not a photo, not a dollar. I stared at the floor, swallowing the heat in my throat. It was Lorraine who finally spoke. It's what your father wanted, she said flatly. He believed Juliet had proven herself responsible. You've always been a bit distant. Distant? I repeated, my voice cracking. I was here, every holiday, every call. I cleaned this house while you watched television. Lorraine didn't flinch. That doesn't make up for the choices you've made. What choices? She only shrugged. Juliet glanced over, offered a small, almost apologetic smile. I didn't know what was in the will, Claire. But the tone in her voice said she wasn't sorry. Not really. She was relieved. Triumphant, even. I left that night. Drove home in the dark with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't cry, not then. I just kept hearing the words, I leave her my love. Like a scrap tossed to a beggar. The following week, I received a thin envelope in the mail. Inside was a single-page letter from my mother. No return address, no greeting. Claire, you've always chosen to stand apart. You've lived your life in your own world, and we respected that. But we didn't understand it. Your father felt you turned your back on us years ago. I agreed. Please don't make this more painful than it needs to be. Juliet deserves what she's getting. You know that. I folded the letter slowly and placed it in the fire. Watched the edges curl. It wasn't anger I felt. Not exactly. It was the absence of it. A hollow stillness. And in that stillness, an idea began to form. Not out of revenge, not even spite. Just clarity. If they believed I didn't deserve anything, then maybe it was time I gave them exactly what they thought I was capable of. A gift, my final one. I started by clearing off the desk in the guest room, what I used to call my office, even though no one but me ever stepped foot in there. Bills, old receipts, unused stationery. I sorted everything into piles like I'd done 100 times for clients, except this time, it wasn't for them. It was for me. I didn't know what I was doing at first. I just knew I needed to do something. I felt too calm, too deliberate, like I'd slipped into a role I hadn't played in years. There was no crying, no screaming, just the quiet hum of purpose. The first thing I did was request my father's business records. He'd owned a small contracting company years ago, Holloway & Sons, though he only had daughters. It shut down in the early 2000s, but I knew there were assets never reported properly. Land bought under the company's name, a storage unit he always paid in cash. I had access to old ledgers. I knew what to look for. Juliet wouldn't. She was never the numbers type. I started calling county clerk's offices, piecing together property records. Late nights, long emails, some polite lies to nudge the process along. I wasn't doing anything illegal, not yet, but I wasn't exactly playing fair either. Then I went to visit my old neighbor, Mr. Keeley. He used to be a title examiner before he retired and still had contacts. We chatted for hours over black coffee. I told him I was helping with a little inheritance research. He didn't ask questions. He liked me. He never liked Juliet. Your folks always treated you like the second pancake, he muttered as he slid over some forms. Never understood that. Second pancake. The one you toss while the griddle heats. I almost laughed. Over the next 2 weeks, I built a file, a real one, thick and worn and tucked behind the cereal boxes in my kitchen. Inside were copies of deeds, appraisals, and a list of all the assets my father had once quietly accumulated, ones never mentioned in the official will, technically unclaimed, hidden in plain sight. I wasn't going to steal anything. I wasn't going to forge a signature or break into a safe. That would have been too easy, too dirty. Instead, I was going to dig deeper into the one thing Juliet and Lorraine had never respected, the truth. But before that, I needed to see Juliet again, in person, not a phone call, not an email. I needed to look her in the eyes and see if there was anything left in her that remembered we were once just 2 girls in bunk beds, whispering secrets in the dark. I dressed plainly, slacks, sweater, no makeup, and took the train to Manhattan. Her building had a doorman. Of course it did. I told him I was her sister. He buzzed upstairs, paused, then waved me in. Juliet opened the door with a look that tried to be warm, but didn't quite reach her eyes. Claire, she said, this is unexpected. I smiled. I won't stay long. She stepped aside. Her apartment was spotless, full of cream-colored furniture and glass. There were family portraits on the wall, her husband, her kids, even Lorraine holding the younger one at a birthday party. I wasn't in a single frame. "Why did you do it?" I asked quietly. She didn't pretend not to understand. "Because I earned it," she said. "You think Mom and Dad were perfect? They made a decision based on who showed up, not just physically, but who made them proud." And that wasn't me. She didn't answer. That was all I needed. I left Juliet's apartment with no goodbyes, just silence. Back home, I spread everything out on the dining table. A map, a list of properties. The old warehouse on Route 14 that had been used by Holloway & Sons until it shut down. Still registered in my father's name. No lions, no heirs assigned, no mention in the will. Forgotten, perhaps even by him in the end. But it was real. And it was valuable. The place had been locked up for years. I drove out there on a gray afternoon, armed with bolt cutters and a flashlight. The lot was overgrown, rusted chain-link fencing bent where time and weather had pressed in. The door gave with some force. Inside, it was like stepping into a time capsule. Tools hung on the wall, dust-coated tarps covered boxes, a faded workbench stretched across the back wall. In the corner sat a heavy filing cabinet. It took effort, but I pried it open. Inside were receipts, permits, and a few handwritten notes in my father's neat script. Names, dates, contracts with local vendors. One folder was labeled, "Lorraine, Safe." I froze. I took the folder home. It contained copies of letters between my mother and a man named Franklin Burroughs, an estate attorney in Albany. The letters dated back 20 years. They discussed something called a quiet trust set up in Juliet's name. Funded, oddly enough, with a life insurance policy not tied to Charles, but to Lorraine herself. One letter even referenced protecting Juliet's future in case Claire decides to interfere. So they'd planned for this. Planned for me not to be in the picture. I wasn't just overlooked. I was deliberately written out. It had been in motion for decades. I read those letters twice, then placed them in my file. I didn't feel rage. I felt vindicated. The next day, I booked an appointment with a lawyer in town, a woman named Margot Leeds. I chose her carefully. She wasn't flashy, but she was sharp. The kind of lawyer who read every footnote. I brought her my file and laid it out, page by page. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and looked at me with narrowed eyes. "You're not trying to sue for the estate?" I shook my head. "No, I don't want the house or the money. I want to reclaim what wasn't supposed to be hidden, and I want it to be public." She raised an eyebrow. "You want exposure?" I nodded. "I want Juliet and my mother to answer questions, not to me, to everyone else." She sat forward. "If this goes to probate court, it becomes part of public record. You'll be questioned, too." "I'm fine with that." She smiled slightly. "Most people come here asking how to make things go away. You're the first I've seen in months who wants to pull back the curtain." That was exactly what I wanted. I left her office with a plan. It would take time. But once filed, the court would be obligated to examine the unlisted assets, especially if there was evidence they were intentionally concealed. Lorraine and Juliet might have kept me out of the will, but the law didn't like secrets, and they had plenty. The petition was filed the following Thursday. Margot moved fast, and the moment it hit the county probate court, the wheels began to turn. We requested an official review of unlisted assets associated with the estate of Charles Holloway, citing evidence of concealment and financial misrepresentation. It wasn't just a formality, it was a shot fired. 3 days later, I got the first call. Lorraine. "Claire," she said, her voice tight and breathy. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" I let the silence hang for a second. Then, calmly, I replied, "Making sure everything's accounted for." "You're trying to shame this family." "No," I said. "You already did that. I'm just making it official." She hung up. 2 hours after that, Juliet called. Her tone was cooler, controlled. "This isn't like you," she said. "You're usually so quiet." "Maybe you never knew me as well as you thought," I answered. I could hear her jaw tighten through the phone. "You're just doing this to get attention. You think you're some kind of hero now?" "No," I said softly. "I just got tired of pretending it didn't happen." Click. And then came the fallout. Slowly at first. A local journalist, someone I vaguely remembered from high school, called me 2 days later. She'd seen the court filing. "This is going to be public record," she said. "Mind if I reach out again when the story develops?" I agreed. A week after that, Juliet's name was mentioned in a real estate blog. Nothing dramatic, just a passing note about a developing estate matter involving assets not listed in the will of the late Charles Holloway. But it was enough. Her clients were image-obsessed. Whispers started. Calls were missed. Then a leak. I didn't know where it came from. Maybe the court. Maybe someone with access to my file. But one of the letters between Lorraine and Franklin Burroughs showed up online. Redacted, but real. It quoted Lorraine saying she couldn't allow Claire to interfere again. Again? What had I ever done to be seen as interference? That word stuck in my mind like a splinter. Margot wasn't surprised by the leak. "The more noise, the better," she said. "It puts pressure on them. Let them feel it." And they did. Juliet started calling old friends, trying to get ahead of the story. Lorraine withdrew from her weekly bridge group. Their silence, once a weapon, had become their prison. Meanwhile, I stayed quiet. I didn't give interviews. I didn't argue online. I just waited. Let the process unfold. But in the evenings, I started writing. At first, it was just notes, memories, dates, half-thoughts. But it turned into something more. A statement. A record of what had been taken from me. Not the money, not the house, but the belonging. The right to say, I mattered here. I wasn't seeking pity. I was rebuilding my own version of the truth, one where I wasn't invisible. I kept writing. Every evening after dinner, after the dishes were done and the dog fed, I sat at my kitchen table and put it all down. Not just the facts, those were for the court, but the truth as I had lived it. The birthday they forgot. The Christmas I spent alone when the roads were clear and the phone never rang. The day in 1994 when I told my mother I was thinking of moving to Chicago for a job, and she said, "Why would anyone want you out there?" I never went. I didn't write for sympathy. I wrote to understand. My entire life had been a fog of wondering what I had done wrong. But the more I wrote, the more I saw how little of it was mine to carry. One evening, I stumbled across an old box of photos, years of snapshots in fading colors. One, in particular, stopped me. Juliet, about 21, standing in front of a courthouse. She wasn't smiling. Neither was Lorraine, standing beside her. Behind them, out of focus, was a man I hadn't seen in decades. Tommy Reeves. My stomach turned. Tommy had been my boyfriend once. My first serious one. We dated through college, made plans to move in together. He was funny, kind, soft, in a way few men allowed themselves to be back then. I loved him in the way you can only love when you're young and you don't know yet what love will cost. And one day, he was just gone. No fight, no phone call, just vanished. I'd blamed myself, convinced I'd said the wrong thing or been too needy. But now I was staring at a picture of him standing behind my sister and my mother in front of a courthouse. I pulled out my old journals, kept sporadically over the years, and flipped back to 1991. There it was, the week he left. My entry was short. Tommy didn't call again. Mom said he probably saw the truth and ran. Maybe she's right. I always ruin things. It made me sick. I spent the next day digging deeper. A public record search showed that Tommy had been involved in a brief legal dispute around that same time, something about a confidentiality agreement and a dropped complaint. The records were vague, redacted. But the date lined up with the photo. I emailed Margot and asked if she could request court access to any filings involving Lorraine Holloway or Juliet Harrow from 1991 through 1993. She didn't ask why. She just nodded. Later that night, I sat on the back porch with my tea and tried to put it together. It wasn't just about money. Not anymore. They hadn't just cut me out of a will. They'd edited me out of my own life. They'd taken moments, relationships, choices, even chances, and rewritten them, deciding what I got to keep and what I didn't. And I'd let them. Not anymore. It took Margot a week to get the court documents. Most of the names were redacted, but a judge granted access to partial transcripts under review. The complaint had been civil, not criminal. The file was labeled Harrow v. R., and from what we could gather, Lorraine had filed on behalf of Juliet, not against Tommy directly, but against a local employer, a man Tommy had worked under briefly that summer. But the odd thing was the settlement. Hushed, sealed, and paid out within 30 days. Fast, quiet, tied off with a bow. Margot frowned as she flipped through the copies. "This is strange," she muttered. "These kinds of settlements usually happen when someone wants everything buried. Fast." "Who was paying to bury it?" I asked. "Hard to say," she replied. "But look here, Juliet isn't listed as a direct plaintiff, just mentioned as a dependent." "Dependent?" I blinked. "She was 21. Margot nodded slowly. "Exactly. It didn't make sense, until I got a call from a blocked number. I didn't answer the first time, or the second, but the third time something told me to pick up. "Claire?" The voice was raspy, tired, but familiar. "Tommy?" A pause. Then, I heard you've been asking questions." "Yes." Another pause. "I shouldn't be calling." "Then why are you?" "Because I should have done it a long time ago." I sat down slowly. The receiver pressed so tight to my ear it hurt. "I didn't leave you, Claire. I was pushed." "By who?" "Your mother. She came to my work, said I was confusing your future. Said if I didn't back off, there'd be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "She had pictures of me and someone I worked with. Said she'd send them to my boss, to my parents. Said she'd tell you I'd cheated, that I was a liar." I could barely breathe. "She told me you'd never believe me anyway," he continued. "And back then, I believed her." "But there was a court case?" He exhaled. "There was a girl at the office, just a coworker. Lorraine spun it into a harassment claim. She pressured her into signing a statement. I didn't do anything, Claire, I swear." "I believe you." There was silence on the line, thick and heavy. Then he said, "I kept your letters. All of them. I just couldn't read them." We didn't say goodbye. The call ended like a slow exhale. I sat in that silence for a long time. It wasn't about heartbreak anymore. It was about erasure. Lorraine had taken things from me not because I failed, but because I didn't fit her plan. And Juliet? She either knew or she didn't care. Later that night, I opened the document file I'd been working on, my personal statement. I added a new section, titled simply 1991, The Disappearance. I wrote until my hands cramped, not as a victim, but as a witness. They had spent their lives building a story where Juliet was golden and I was disposable. But now, my story was the one being told. I hadn't planned to see Lorraine again. I thought I was done with face-to-face confrontations. But after the call with Tommy, something shifted in me. Not anger, not vengeance, just certainty. I needed to look her in the eyes and give her the chance to deny what she'd done, or admit it. I drove to the house, the same one where I'd scrubbed countertops and patched her fence just days after burying my father. It looked smaller now, older, like the lies had stripped it of its dignity. Lorraine answered the door with a sour expression, not surprised to see me, but clearly annoyed. "If you're here to demand money—" "I'm not." I stepped inside without waiting. I walked to the kitchen. She followed, arms crossed. "Why did you do it?" I asked. She narrowed her eyes. "You'll need to be more specific, Claire. Tommy, the threats, the photos, the fake complaint, all of it. Why?" Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't deny it. Not outright. "You were always too fragile," she said eventually. "You latched on, dreamed big, you were naive. That boy was never going to stay. I just expedited the inevitable." "No, you manipulated it," I said. "You stole something from me and dressed it up as protection." "I did what mothers do." I laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You did what you do, which is erase anything you can't control." She turned away, but I kept going. "You want to know what this whole thing is about? Why I filed the petition? Why I let the reporters come sniffing around? It's not about the money. It never was. It's about giving you something you've never had to live with. Exposure." She turned back, face pale now. "You buried the truth so long, you thought it couldn't breathe anymore. But it's still here. and I'm not hiding it." She didn't speak again. I left her standing there, surrounded by the hollow quiet of a house filled with things she never earned. The next morning, I finalized my statement with Margot. She looked at me over the top of her glasses. "If we submit this to the probate court as a supporting document, it becomes public record." "Good," I said, "and the press will follow." "I'm counting on it." The document was 32 pages. Not all legal. Much of it was personal. A record of erasure. A record of survival. That same week, a regional paper ran a story. "Daughter fights to reclaim lost legacy. After will exclusion reveals deeper secrets." It didn't name Lorraine directly, but it didn't have to. Juliet's office released a statement calling it a private family matter. She canceled 2 open houses and took a leave of absence to deal with personal affairs. My phone buzzed with unknown numbers, some reporters, some old acquaintances I hadn't heard from in years, and then a card. No name, just a handwritten note. "I see you now. I'm sorry it took this long. I didn't know who sent it. Maybe Tommy. Maybe someone else. Maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that I was no longer the secret they got away with keeping. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. No lawsuits, no dramatic family implosions, just a subtle shift in the air, like a heavy door that had finally swung open after years of pressure. I still went to work, answered emails, made tea, fed the neighbor's cat while she was on vacation. The world didn't stop, but I had changed. And for once, the change didn't feel like damage. It felt like clarity. The court sent a formal notice acknowledging receipt of the documentation and approving a full review of the unlisted assets. The estate would be reopened for examination, including the trust. Margot said it was a strong case, and while I likely wouldn't receive financial compensation directly, the public record would force Juliet and Lorraine to answer for the omissions, maybe even back taxes, penalties. Still, that wasn't the part I kept thinking about. I kept returning to the letters, the silence, the way I'd been cut out of the family narrative, not just legally, but emotionally, generationally. It was never about money. It was about worth. Juliet tried to call once. I didn't answer. She left a voicemail, her voice brittle. "You've made your point, Claire. Congratulations. You got attention. I hope it was worth it." It was the same tone she'd always used when she lost a game as a kid. Not anger, not apology, just entitlement with a crack in it. I didn't call back. One afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was Lorraine. She looked older, smaller, no pearls, no makeup, just a cardigan and a slight tremor in her hand. "I don't expect forgiveness," she said quietly. "I just wanted to see you." I stood in the doorway, unsure. "I read what you wrote," she added. "All of it." "And?" She didn't answer right away. "I didn't know what to do with you, Claire. You were different. You didn't follow. You didn't ask how high. I didn't know how to love that." I swallowed hard. "And Juliet?" "She did what was expected. She played the part." I stepped aside. She didn't enter, but she stood a little straighter. "You have a spine," she said softly. "I didn't give you credit for that." I didn't cry. I didn't hug her. I didn't slam the door. I just nodded. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the folder where I'd stored every file, photo, and page of this process. I renamed it The Gift. It wasn't a gift to them. It was to myself. The first thing I'd ever claimed that hadn't been approved or permitted. It was messy, imperfect, but it was mine. And for the first time, I felt like I had truly been seen. A month passed, then another. The legal process continued in its slow, bureaucratic rhythm. Margot updated me weekly. The unlisted assets were officially acknowledged. The estate was amended. Tax inquiries were opened. Lorraine and Juliet would have some explaining to do. But I didn't obsess over the filings. Not anymore. Instead, I kept writing. I turned my files and journals into chapters. Not polished, not pretty, but honest. I found a local publisher who specialized in small-run memoirs. They weren't interested in drama for drama's sake, but when they read my first 3 chapters, the editor called me. "This isn't about scandal," she said. "This is about survival." That word stuck with me. I agreed to publish the story under my real name, No pen name, no erasure. In February, I gave my first reading at the town library. 15 people showed up. Some I knew. Most I didn't. A woman near the back cried quietly as I read the part about losing Tommy. Another nodded when I described the way silence can strangle more than cruelty. Afterward, people stayed behind. Not for autographs, just to talk. One woman said, "My sister got everything too. I was told to smile and move on." Another whispered, "I kept thinking it was just me. It wasn't. I hadn't just written my story. I had cracked open something bigger, a quiet epidemic. Women written out of their own families, their own legacies. Told to stay quiet, to be nice, to let it go. I didn't let it go. I gave talks at a few libraries, then a college women's group. I was invited to write a guest column in a regional paper. It was all small scale, but it was enough. It was real. Tommy wrote to me. A short letter. No pressure, just honesty. He was remarried. 2 kids. But he said what happened still haunted him. He said he was proud of me for not folding. I wrote back. No resentment, no yearning, just gratitude. We had both survived. That was enough. Juliet never called again. I saw her name once in a tabloid blog. Prominent broker linked to estate misconduct. The article faded in a few days. But she didn't. She would live with the truth, even if she never admitted it. As for Lorraine, I never saw her again after that day at my door. But a week before her birthday, I received a package. No note. Just an old family photo album. One I hadn't seen in decades. Every page was intact, except the last, torn out. I closed the cover. Some stories stay unfinished. But mine? Mine finally had an ending. Not one they chose. One I wrote myself.